Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me here for this Zoom conversation between myself, Nicholas Nakos, and esteemed academic and author, Clive Hamilton. Welcome, Clive.
Thanks, Nick.
It would have been great to have sat down with you at the Capitol Theatre in May on Mother's Day weekend to talk all things that we're going to chat about here, but the world's changed a little bit. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me virtually today. We're here to talk about your book, Hidden Hand, which is set for release on the 16th of June across Australia, which you've co-authored with Marika Olberg. And we're going to touch on a number of different topics, including media, politics and espionage, and all of those entwined with the work of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP has been in the media quite a bit recently in Victoria in particular with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. It is a topic that you have mentioned in the book in a few different chapters. Are you able to explain to our audience why they should perhaps be cautious about the Belt and Road Initiative, especially Victorians?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is ostensibly China's, Beijing's way of using surplus capital and expertise and going out into the world and building this road, which is basically across Central Asia to Europe, and the belt, oddly enough, which is across kind of seas down into this part of the world, with a view to helping countries build infrastructure and advance connectivity, help China's trade and everybody's trade and investment. But if you examine as we have, particularly with and Marika, my co-author, have examined the way party theorists and senior cadres talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, they're pretty clear that they see the BRI as which was initiated by Xi Jinping, as a way of advancing China's geopolitical influence around the world. And we have seen how that operates in a range of countries which have signed up to the BRI and have accepted a whole bunch of investments from China and Chinese businesses. And in some countries we see that increased commercial and business activity really enhance the influence of Beijing within the capitals over the governments of those countries. So it's very naive to believe that the BRI is what it claims to be, this way of enhancing international harmony through global connectivity. You really need to understand how the Chinese Communist Party works, how the Chinese Communist Party thinks, going back deep into its history. And you see that this kind of thing you have to be extremely careful about.
Why is it then that the Victorian government, do you think, is deciding to move forward with its plans with the BRI despite the federal government not exactly endorsing the idea?
Well, I've looked pretty carefully at this from the point of view of how the Chinese Communist Party goes about its influence operations. I mean, it's a very interesting question. Why has the CCP managed to persuade the Victorian government to sign a BRI agreement, but other governments, and particularly the federal government, have eschewed the possibility of signing up to this, massive economic benefit for the citizens of their state, or in the case of the federal government, for Australia as a whole. And I think the explanation is not that Daniel Andrews has a particularly enlightened view of the possibilities of the Belt and Road Agreement, but that Daniel Andrews in particular and other members of the Victorian government have been carefully cultivated over many years by United Front operatives and Chinese Communist Party cadres, and have formed a very kind of pro-Beijing view. And so Daniel Andrews in particular has been persuaded that he has a particular insight into China, that he has very great friendships in Beijing and with Chinese people, and he has therefore come to accept the view, which has been put into his ear over many years, that this is going to be a bonanza for Victoria, that Victoria can become, as he says, China's gateway into Australia. But in fact, I think that he has been he's been groomed to adopt the role that he has adopted. And in a way, what I've done in my earlier book, Silent Invasion, for the Australian case, and now Hidden Hand with Marika Olberg for the West generally, is trace and explain the way the Chinese Communist Party goes about this grooming of the elites in Western countries. That's the kind of secret to the way it operates.
Absolutely, and you do in the book mention a couple of different examples in different parts of the world where it's not looking at the people in the federal positions, but it's grooming from lower government roles. And that is that something that you might think is happening in other parts of Australia right now?
Well, I think that yes, that goes a long way towards explaining the position of the Andrews government in Victoria. And what we see, and we explain in the book, and we see being played out in Australia and in many Western countries, is a Communist Party tactic that goes right back to the 1930s, when it was being defeated by the nationalists, the Kuomintang, and driven out of the cities. And so under Mao Zedong, the Communist Party kind of regrouped and adopted this strategy that they called use the countryside to surround the cities, which meant build strength, in their case, amongst the peasantry. And when you're sufficiently strong, you have sufficient influence and control outside of the cities, then to move in and take control of the cities. And this tactic is like several others which we discuss in the book, which goes deep into the history of the Chinese Communist Party and which is playing out around the world today. So what we've seen in Australia over the last few years is this. Since Canberra got tough on China, particularly under the Turnbull government, which came to the view, and this was a big turnaround for Malcolm Turnbull, which he, in fact, owns up to in his autobiography. He was persuaded away from a kind of panda-hugging view, if I can put it in that crude way, to a far more sceptical view about China under the CCP in Australia, basically by intelligence reports and by other influential people around him. And so Canberra got tougher, and it took a whole series of measures which were really quite shocking to Beijing. One was banning Huawei from our 5G network, which other Five Eyes countries are following. The United States followed us. The United Kingdom is almost certain to. Canada is really wavering. New Zealand looks as though it will ban Huawei. And the other thing that it did, which also really shocked Beijing, was to pass the foreign interference legislation, which basically is targeted at united front activity aimed at influencing grooming elites in Australia. So what the CCP did was, in Australia, when it became more hostile in Canberra, it moved to the states, to the state capitals, and became far more active, using the countryside to surround the cities. And so it was extremely active and has been really advanced its influence, in particular in Melbourne, in Perth, in Darwin, even in little old Hobart. There's now a great deal of United Front activity where there wasn't 5 or 6 years ago. And so this is an instance of CCP going out to the provinces in this case. But it also, and this is, I have to say, this is one of the things that I found most fascinating in researching the book. One of the things that the party does is it uses sister city relationships, again, at a local government level rather than the state or provincial government, to cultivate local government officials to become very friendly towards Beijing. And so it uses sister city relationships in this very kind of instrumentalist way. A couple of really important things to note here. One is, look, sister city relationships are great, but you have to be really, really careful when you're doing it in China. But if you're doing it with Japan or Germany or the United States, you know, it's one metropolis speaking to the government of another metropolis or a small place. And, you know, they think it's going to be great to have people-to-people exchange. You know, I'm adopting CCP language already. To have cultural and other exchanges and bring the two peoples closer together in those cities. But in the case of the Chinese Communist Party, that's not the case. It's centrally managed and it's carefully arranged so that the cities in China are acting on behalf of Beijing rather than independently. And so what we see is in Canada, for example, the embassy there will organise cocktail parties at the annual convention of mayors. Now, it's the only nation in the world that would bother going and engaging in diplomatic activity with mayors. But the reason they do it is to gain influence locally, because they can then use that to exert influence on the centre, but also because they know from experience that if they groom a whole bunch of local government politicians and mayors, some of those, a small percentage, but some of them will go to state level politics and some of them will end up in federal politics. So they have friends in high places. That's how it works.
So obviously the exertion of influence starts and it is a long game for the CCP. It's not something that they're looking to get an immediate dividend on. But the Australian government, as you mentioned, has taken a stance that's been a little bit harsher on China than some other governments. But China hasn't sat idly by and recently announced that it was introducing tariffs on Australian barley. Do you think that this sets up a trade war with China, and do you think that that will have a negative impact on Australia's relationship with China?
That's a very good question, because what's interesting about these latest events between Australia and China and the barley and beef bans, with others kind of like coal threatened, is that the Ambassador Cheng made that extraordinary statement after our Foreign Minister Marise Payne suggested the world should have an independent inquiry into the origin and impacts and responses to the COVID-19 catastrophe. Perfectly reasonable suggestion. Beijing doesn't want an independent inquiry. It's got too much to cover up, as we now know. And so then the ambassador made a pretty blunt threat. You know, look out, if you pursue this globally, we are going to punish you economically. And he named 4 important sectors: universities, tourism, I've forgotten to, beef, I think, wasn't it? And the fourth escaped me.
I think, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Iron and other resources, I think, some of the other minerals that they...
It was interesting that he avoided iron, because China needs iron and has no substitute for it. So they weren't going to threaten iron. And so, but after that threat, international support for the Australian proposal swung into gear. European Union took it up, and as we know, a couple of weeks later, the World Health Assembly unanimously, even with China backing it because they knew the writing was on the wall, resolved to have an international inquiry. Now, the interesting thing is, Beijing has decided to implement these bans on barley and beef after Australia was successful in triggering this international move, which would have happened anyway, sooner or later. So why were they punishing us when the deed had been done? Well, I think they're punishing us to send a message to other middle powers who may have in mind doing something that displeases Beijing. And the message clearly is, if you do undertake these kinds of actions, which we don't like, then we will punish you. And of course, China, under the CCP, has become the master of so-called economic statecraft. It's a very kind of bland term for what is effectively blackmail, and that is using your economic might in order to ensure political acquiescence. And the nations around China, thinking of South Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines, they can tell you all about it. And now it's come here. And so it's particularly important for Australia not to buckle under the pressure, despite business types and various pro-Beijing commentators saying, "Oh, this is terrible, it upset Beijing, it's all our fault. We have to change." Well, we're not the global bullies. We're just pursuing, the right thing. And so that's why it's important that in this case and in others that we quietly stand our ground.
Given the coronavirus pandemic, it's going to create such enormous strain on economies all over the world. Do you think that gives the CCP an opportunity to go into markets and areas where they might not have traditionally have been able to access because economies across the world will be so desperate? And a second point is that given the pandemic and the measures that China has mentioned, do Australia's industries such as barley and beef need China and export more now than ever before? And does that place them in a perilous position moving forward?
It's quite a complex question. Certainly, a number of countries around the world, including Australia and definitely EU countries, quite quickly implemented measures to protect their companies from predatory buy-ups by Chinese companies or any others coming from countries that have come out of the COVID-19 crisis earlier. But there's little doubt that these measures taken by the countries I just mentioned were aimed at were a kind of urgent measure to protect companies, particularly strategic ones, from being snapped up while they're in a distressed situation. On the trade question, yes, countries in economic difficulty are going to want to grab any kind of trade opportunity they can. On the other hand, there are a whole bunch of industries in Australia who are now saying, we are suffering greatly as a result of our over-dependence on China. You think of the university sector, for example. You think of tourism. And now with these trade penalties, think of beef and barley and others, particularly in the agriculture sector, are now realise they're in quite a dire position of dependency. And so they have to make a kind of hard business decision, and that is, do we reopen the level of dependency that we've had with China and risk being used for political purposes, sovereign risk as it's known, or do we put a lot more effort into reducing our dependency on this particular market and growing our markets elsewhere? It's a lot easier said than done, of course, but I think that many industries will work hard to try to diversify their markets away from China, and to the extent that they can't, they'll be putting in hedging measures to protect them from being used as a political instrument when Beijing becomes unhappy with an action by a government like Australia's.
Your book touches on media and the CCP's influence and impact on media, and it's really ramped up in recent times. To your knowledge, does the CCP have a vested interest in Australian media and an influence in Australian media at all?
Well, the first thing we need to do is to distinguish between Chinese language media in Australia and, let's say, mainstream media in Australia. In the first case, the Chinese Communist Party and its agencies and proxies and so on control virtually all of the Chinese language media in Australia. including social media. Weibo and WeChat are extremely popular amongst Chinese Australians, particularly more recent arrivals over the last 20 or 30 years from mainland China. And they are essentially controlled and censored from Beijing. So you have this extraordinary situation where Australian citizens are having social media conversations with other Australian citizens, and their conversations are being monitored and censored in Beijing, and somehow we allow this to happen. Virtually all Chinese language newspapers and radio stations are controlled by pro-Beijing companies. That's been pretty well established now. There are a couple of exceptions, in particular the Vision Times, which is an independent Chinese language newspaper, and of course the Epoch Times, which is the Falun Gong newspaper. When we get to mainstream media, the CCP has tried quite hard through various mechanisms to gain some influence over those media. Probably the most well-known example is the China Daily, a party-controlled English language newspaper, which pays some of our most prominent media outlets quite large amounts of money to have monthly inserts, which is essentially propaganda in them. I don't think that's worked very well. You might see it as a way of signalling to certain pro-Beijing people in Australia, in the diaspora, for example, that here's Beijing's line. This is how you might want to think and argue. The other thing that has happened, and this I don't want to exaggerate this. I think it's a relatively small thing, but it's certainly something that bothers me, and that is that there are certain journalists who work in public broadcasting in Australia who are certainly pro-Beijing and have strong links to United Front organisations in Australia, and that's particularly the case at SBS. And indeed, I've had journalists from SBS, telling me of their serious concerns about not just pro-Beijing people, actually people who work there who are members of the Chinese Communist Party.
How can organisations then go about mitigating circumstances like this? It's not something that they would probably be aware of when they're employing such individuals, and particularly in Australia, it's not something that would be vetted. What can be done about it?
But you don't have to. There are plenty of people around who can identify these people. I mean, for example, the Australian Financial Review had a person until a couple of months ago who now works for a CCP, a Hong Kong-based news agency, but there was a Sydney-based journalist from the mainland originally who worked at the Fin Review and was fanatically pro-Beijing. You only had to look at her Twitter feed to see that. I found it shocking that the Fin Review would continue to employ her. She was just a propagandist, and you could see it in the stories that she wrote. So I don't know why. I mean, the Fin Review is kind of a special case because they have turned themselves into the softly on China news outlet in Australia. But we, on the positive side, I mean, one of the reasons why Australia is looked to as a kind of world leader in the West in pushing back against CCP influence activities, a large part of that is due to some really fantastic reporting in Australian news outlets. Beginning around about 2016, although there were a couple of fantastic stories by John Garno, for example, dating back to 2015. And since then, we have seen all of the major news networks, the ABC, the Fairfax, now 9 newspapers, and the Murdoch newspapers, who are publishing very strong investigative reports exposing CCP activities in Australia. And that's a huge difference between us and pretty much every country in Europe and between us and Canada, for example, where CCP influence is a much greater problem now.
You mentioned Weibo and WeChat, and that feeds into a thread I wanted to mention about espionage and spying. So you mentioned that you're not sure how these apps are allowed in Australia. Are you able to detail a little bit about how the CCP navigates these sort of technological devices and means of monitoring and surveilling people, not only in their own country, but clearly in countries abroad?
All media, of course, in China are a large portion of it is state-owned, and those that are privately owned effectively follow CCP guidelines. A couple of notable and very noble exceptions of news outlets that try desperately hard to kind of walk that line of publishing straight and important stories without earning the ire of the party and being disciplined or shut down. There are a couple of those that managed to do that, and we really owe them a great debt. But most news outlets are rigidly controlled, and that goes for the privately owned social media apps, Weibo and WeChat. And they are rigidly censored because the CCP is terrified of public anger or public disgust getting out of hand, or ridicule of Xi Jinping, which many Chinese people are only willing to do at the drop of a hat. And so they are rigidly censored, as we saw incidentally in Wuhan, when netizens were, for some weeks, were quite free to discuss and debate and so on about the coronavirus outbreak. And then the CCP thought, no, this is getting out of control, this is dangerous, this is stirring up public anger and mistrust of the party, so they closed it down straight away. And so that means that since all those social media apps operate out of China, the party can regulate the use of them where outside of China as well. Now, what's fascinating here is that we have, I'm told by the Chinese media experts in Australia, that huge numbers, a huge portion of the diaspora in Australia are very heavily dependent on these apps, in addition to other Chinese language media. As I said, which are nearly all controlled by the CCP. So this raises an extremely interesting question, which I haven't heard anyone pose before, and I don't know the answer. And that is, why do so many people of Chinese heritage in Australia, for example, choose to live behind the Great Firewall? I mean, they don't need to, they choose to. And, I'm told by the experts in this that, first of all, there's a language thing, of course, that there aren't many good alternative Chinese language outlets. It appeals very much to Chinese culture and this kind of social milieu. People just like it. They get a lot of material about China. And yet it's censored. It's like living in a Chinese media environment. They choose to do that because the benefits outweigh the costs of free speech and free thought. This is a real puzzle. It's something that we need to grapple with. So I didn't really answer your question, but it's just a fascinating kind of landscape of media to try and get your head around before you can think about issues like espionage.
Absolutely, and your book touches on the influence in Europe and also in North America and even to the periphery as well. So it really does show that the CCP has got its arms out all over the world. Speaking particularly about North America, there's been a lot of talk in recent months where Donald Trump has been very outspoken about his thoughts and views about China. Do you see that as being destructive to the world dialogue with China, because the United States-China relationship is one that is so integral to the economies all over the world?
This is such a big question, Nick. I mean, I think the important thing, let's try and sort out what are some of the important aspects of this. One is that Beijing and CCP leaders have been very shocked and thrown out by Donald Trump's trade war and his extremely strong and often racist language. But I think it's also true that, put it this way, if I were a CCP boss in Beijing, taking note of the forthcoming presidential election in the US, there's no doubt in my mind who I would want to win, and that is Donald Trump. Because Trump is so lacking in strategy. He's so prone to kind of instinctual outbursts, which are often very damaging to him, to the US, and to the cause of pushing back against CCP influence. But more particularly, and worst of all, Trump has been highly destructive of the alliance system. He's been dismissive. He's attacked US friends, particularly across Europe. He bagged NATO. He's insulted the French and the British, and and because he's been, he is for any, except for Trumpians in the United States, apparently 40% of the voting public. Everywhere else in the Western world, he's such a repellent character that it makes it much easier for the Chinese Communist Party to advance its interests. So the breakdown of the alliance system, the way that so many people are kind of repelled at, rebelling against the United States because Trump is so obnoxious, that makes it so much easier for the CCP to advance its influence through the world. If Joe Biden wins, and Joe Biden, as we explained in the book, is not without his problems in relation to China, but nevertheless, you can imagine what it would be for the CCP if you had someone who was pushing back against CCP influence, but doing it in a far more thoughtful, strategic and systematic way, which is what I think Biden would do. He would therefore be a much greater threat.
Almost halfway through, almost at the end, should I say, of Donald Trump's first term in presidency, and if he achieves a second term, what you're saying is that the CCP would look favourably upon Donald Trump returning for a second term.
Look, I think if Trump is re-elected, so many people, including myself, have been just kind of hanging on and thinking, okay, Trump is disastrous in so many ways. The United States can somehow survive 4 years, but it can't survive 8 years. It'll be so radically transformed, and the whole structure of the world and the alliance system will be so ruined that it can't be brought back. And so if Trump wins, the kind of chaos in the world that he creates will provide the opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party to use all of the influence and interference weapons at its disposal to entrench itself in much of the rest of the world in a way that would be, I think, virtually impossible to undo. I mean, that's a kind of big call, I know, and all kinds of things can happen, but, other things being equal, that would be my assessment of it.
Hidden Hand has so many pages of notes and acronyms, and there's so much detail within the book. Are you able to provide our audience with an insight into how you actually go about gathering all this information and what sort of time it took you and resources and who you lean on? Because there is quite literally dozens of pages of notes and information that's outside of the chapters.
Yeah, I was just arrived a few days ago, the first copy, and I was a bit surprised at how fat it was, even fatter than Silent Invasion, whereas the word count seemed to be about the same or even slightly less. I think it's because as you say, more than a third of the book, of the pages, are endnotes mostly, an index, a couple of appendices or glossary, and a kind of a material to help people to understand the whole thing, and for experts who want to check sources to go and look at them. And so Marika and I were extremely diligent about providing solid sources for all of our claims. And so, you will find 10 or 20 footnote numbers on each page as a rule. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, because it makes us feel more comfortable. Two, because other researchers can follow things up. But three, and perhaps most importantly, we know that we will come under very, very close scrutiny from people who are hostile to the argument that we put. And so we want to be make it as airtight as we could make it. And that's one of the things that you do. And, we're both pretty sharp critics of each other. Another thing that, and so let me talk about the research process. It is really having a structure and a kind of broad argument, and then going and reading and collecting as many reasonable sources as you can, and as we say in the book, in English, German, and of course in Chinese. And you have to have that Chinese language ability, which I don't have, but of course Marika does. She's a paid up qualified sinologist who specialises in the Chinese Communist Party's external propaganda system. But I do have people who assist me when it comes to Chinese language sources. Oh, and I should just say, for people who don't use it, Google Translate, which used to be pretty ropey, I use it a lot, and it's pretty damn good if you want to cut and paste a chunk of Chinese characters into it. You'll get a pretty good translation. You'd never use it in a book. You'd always want a native speaker to check it and do a proper translation. So we just consult a vast number of sources. We also talk to a huge number of people, experts in various aspects of it. And then when we put the whole thing together in a draft, we ask other people who are experts in the whole area of influence operations, or in particular areas in certain chapters, if they will read all or part of the book and tell us where we've gone wrong or done some kind of misinterpretation. And so the end product is, you end up feeling pretty confident that you've got the picture right. Look, I think there are 1,800 end notes in the book. We've probably got a couple of things wrong, but you go through all of those processes to try and get it as accurate as possible to sustain the argument that we develop in the book.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the vast range of sources and people that you leaned on. Over what time period was the book being developed? When did you first start to when we've got to now?
We're pretty quick, I have to say. We did it in under 12 months. And I was working pretty much full-time on it, and Marika was working close, bit under that, because she had her job at Merrick's where she had to devote time to her projects there. But she comes from a very strong background in a whole range of areas, not just the external propaganda system, but United Front and so on. And I had a big head start because I'd written Silent Invasion. So that was my template. So I know how it works in Australia. And so I thought, okay, I know where to go and look. I know what to look for in other countries, in Canada, US, Germany, or left that to Marika largely, particularly the United Kingdom, which is an extremely under-researched nation. And when I looked at it initially, after a month or two, I said to Marika, gee, there's not much around. I don't think we're going to be able to find much about the UK. And she said, it's there, just keep looking. And I found it, and it's really an astonishing story, that we managed to tell about influence activities in Britain. One of the things I just want to say, if I can, that how has my view evolved? And of course, it's going to evolve a lot, going from silent invasion focused very much on Australia, then working for another 1 year on Hidden Hand solidly, but also a year prior to that doing a whole bunch of other China-related stuff. Of course, my understanding has deepened a great deal, and one of the things I've learned, in particular over the last 12 or 18 months, very much as a result of working with Maranka, is the extraordinary importance that the Chinese Communist Party attaches to what it calls discourse control. That is, the efforts it takes to shape the narrative globally about China, China's place in the world, and the Chinese Communist Party. Particularly with the accession of Xi Jinping to General Secretary of the party at the end of 2012, they have invested enormous resources into this process. And so there's a lot of that in the book, talking about discourse control and how the CCP goes about it. You mentioned media, but that's not so much in the media. Well, in the CCP's own media, it is definitely. But in universities, in think tanks, in academic work, huge amount of influence work goes into those because they want to try and shape the narrative coming from experts and commentators. And in many ways, they've been very successful.
You mentioned that the CCP has been so effective at being able to in discourse control. Is there a way where we can undo some of that work and not make it as successful in our world that we live in?
Well, they have been very successful, as we detail in the book, and in cultivating influences in the West, say academics, commentators, think tankers, and others involved in Westerners involved in United Front activity, and indeed CCP front groups. The most important thing to do to push back against this is to shed light on it, because this influence activity operates in the shadows. It works because people don't know what's going on. It works because a lot of it sounds kind of plausible, and it works because you don't really know these people who are talking the CCP game, as it were. You don't know much about them. They're just like, well, you know, they're just independent experts and that's their view. And when you start to investigate and look and see where they're coming from, you know, the royal treatment they're given when they go to Beijing, the kind of things they write in various places that when they're not so careful about their public presence, you really start to realise that the CCP has a lot of friends in the West who push its point of view in all kinds of ways and in very subtle ways very often. And one of the kind of smoke screens that it uses constantly, and we see this coming up all of the time, and it's extremely effective, and that is that people like me and the thousands of others like me who push back and criticise the CCP are anti-China. We're xenophobic, we're closet racists, or like Donald Trump, actual racists. And of course, this is untrue. Well, Donald Trump is an actual racist, but people like me, we're not. And that's why so many Chinese people, including many Chinese Australians, love what we do, because they know what the CCP is up to. They've been trying to tell us for years. And someone like me comes along with a book like Silent Invasion, and they're cheering. They're launching my book. They're talking about it. They are encouraging me to get a Chinese translation, which, you know, a Taiwanese publisher was very happy to do. They love this stuff in Taiwan, incidentally. So, you know, go tell them they're xenophobic. And they love it in Hong Kong too. Go tell them they're xenophobic. I mean, really. And yet it's an extremely powerful device, a smokescreen that the CCP and its apologists use, and it works brilliantly on so many people on the left. The left is a real problem because they are so terrified about being accused of being xenophobic that they won't criticise this really monstrous regime that has locked up 1 million Uyghur people in concentration camps and is carrying out cultural genocide while we speak. It's crushing pro-democracy sentiment in Hong Kong ruthlessly, and it's jailing pro-democracy lawyers in China. It's silencing doctors and scientists who want to talk about COVID-19. It's threatening, and I'm very afraid may well, attempt a military invasion of Taiwan, an independent nation of Chinese heritage people, for the most part, who want nothing to do with the mainland. It's an extremely aggressive, almost fascistic country, which is very nationalistic, built around a strong leader which has a cult of personality, and militarising everywhere, seizing land in the South China. But people on the left, it's blindingly obvious. This is not a regime you want to defend it by in any way whatsoever. Not only, of course, people say, of course, I'm not doing that, or ignore its crimes. But so many people on the left are terrified of being accused of being a racist. There's an absolute failure of heart on the left. I think that in years to come, it will be a matter of shame for many people on the left who wish they had spoken out sooner before it was impossible any longer to deny that this is an extremely oppressive regime that no one should have anything to do with.
Well, the book Hidden Hand from Hardy Grant Publishing will be out at all good bookstores and online from the 16th of June, and it is an absolutely terrific read. I got through it in 4 days. It was just gripping reading, and I'm sure that when people get their hands on the book, it will be a book that they will not be able to put down lightly. It is terrific work, Clive. And as I said, very devastated that we couldn't meet at the Bendigo Writers Festival's big bookmark, but perhaps next year and the years to follow, we may meet in person here in Bendigo. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat to the Bendigo Writers Festival and myself today. All the best.
Thanks, Nick. Really enjoyed it. Good on you.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure. Take care.